Dr. Ashley Streig has been kind enough to join us tonight, and she has had 20 years of experience in the field. During this time, she's authored or co-authored, I believe it's something like 30 publications on her work in tectonics, paleoseismology, tectonic geomorphology. Her work has helped with estimating paleo earthquake magnitude and earthquake triggering mechanisms. She's done paleoseismic investigation of numerous faults, including Mount Hood Fault, Gales Creek Fault, Cascadia Subduction Zone in the Northwest, also the Hayward Fault in San Andreas down in California, and several faults in some East Asian countries. She's done field reconnaissance and mapping after surface rupturing earthquakes in Japan, Mexico, and Taiwan, and also has experience with carbon-14 datings and dendrochronology, which I'm sure helps her a lot in this work. So, Dr. Streig, thank you.
Okay, can you see my screen?
We can.
Okay, there's a little lag here. All right, so there we go. Well, thank you very much for having me. I know when you asked me to speak, it was pre-pandemic. You guys are great at planning things out, which is awesome. But I could never have imagined giving a talk in this format, so this is fun. Seems like every day there's some new thing to learn about interacting during the pandemic. I hope everyone is well and healthy, and I'm glad you're here for GSOC and to see me talk about faults and maybe to get in some of the esoteric discussion points when I start talking about detrital charcoal and dendrochronology. So I'm giving two talks tonight. I have two papers that were recently published. Actually, this first one, Paleoseismic Evidence for Holocene Surface Rupturing Earthquakes on the Gales Creek Fault. That one's close to home and near to the heart for all of us, I'm sure. That will be published on the 20th of this month. And I know a couple GSOC folks have read preprints of it that we've read at PSU. And the second half of my talk will be doing a deep dive into how those earthquake age models are kind of created. So when you see people report timing of earthquakes from paleoseismology or timing of prehistoric earthquakes, how are they building those models? And what are some of the problems with the age dates that we're using to build those models? So I'm gonna, like I said, it's a deep dive, but I think it'll be pretty interesting and it'll be fun to kind of you know, get you thinking about and asking questions about the types of data that we present as a science, because the more we talk about it, I think the better we get. Okay, so moving on. First, I'll be talking about the Gales Creek Fault Study. This is a photograph of our trench. This is my graduate student, Allison Horst, and this is her master's thesis work. So with her, I have two PSU undergraduates. This is Alexis and Al, who have both at this time, they've graduated. Our co-investigators on the study, again, Allison is now with Washington DNR, and Ray Wells and John Bershaw, both from Portland State University. We also had the help of an earthquake geology class, and I'll show a photo of them, a couple photos of them during the talk. And this is the citation for our publication. So we already have the article number. It's in press. We're just waiting for it to hit the print. So that should be any day now. Well, I've heard the 20th. Okay, so this is just a quick review of, let me minimize that. Quick review of the tectonic setting here in the Pacific Northwest. We have the Cascadia subduction zone shown there. Okay, and we have the Juan de Fuca plate that is subducting obliquely beneath North America. And there's three types of earthquakes that are happening in our region. So we have large subduction zone earthquakes on the plate interface. We have deep earthquakes that happen in the subducting slab. And we have crustal earthquakes that occur in the forearc. And that's what I'll be talking about today, some of these forearc faults and prehistoric earthquakes that occurred on those faults. Okay, so a bit more on our tectonic setting. This is a GPS figure from Rob McCaffrey publication, 2013. So the northward motion of the Pacific plate and oblique subduction of Juan de Fuca have led to clockwise rotation of the Pacific Northwest. So we see Idaho, Oregon, Washington, and we see this broad rotation of the region. Okay, so that's shown here. And there are models that have been proposed. This is, I think, the most recent model by Wells and McCaffrey. There's several earlier iterations of this. Some block models to explain kind of the broader observations we have of active deformation at the surface. So we have extension here in the basin and range. We see rotation here in the Oregon coast in our forearc. We see compression here at the Yakima Fold and Thrust Belt. So this is another great paper. If you haven't read it, it's a nice kind of regional setting and explanation of all the different types of deformation and how they fit into this bigger picture, and can largely be explained by this clockwise rotation that we observe with GPS. This rotation is also observed with long-term paleomagnetics, so lots of paleomagnetic samples that have been collected, especially on the coast in Oregon. Some of those samples are being rerun now by Ray Weldon at the University of Oregon, and they show the same rotation that we see with modern geodetic or modern GPS. Okay, so how is the rotation we saw in the last figure accommodated in the crust? Okay, so we saw that broader deformation shown by the GPS. We know it has to be, that strain has to be taken up somewhere, and that's occurring along crustal faults. Okay, so this is just a map, a plot of the USGS Quaternary Fault and Fold database. This is a really great resource. There's KMZs available if you're a Google Earth user. You can get shape files. Just Google this first phrase, and you can download the shape files for what's included in this database. So all of these black, green, orange, and blue lines are faults that are included in this database, and orange are the Holocene active structures. And so what you'll notice is that there's an obvious gap in those orange Holocene active structures, you know, here in the forearc, southern Washington, and in Oregon. Okay, and so what we're finding with LiDAR data with better topographic resolution, we're able to start mapping and identifying faults that actually have very youthful geomorphic expression. And so that's what I'm going to show for the Gales Creek Fault. And that's why we went out and did a paleoseismic study on the fault. So before I continue, I want to do a little bit of background on paleoseismology. It's probably not something you have speakers talk about too often. So paleoseismology is essentially the study of prehistoric earthquakes. So we're looking at microstratigraphy and structure at trench scales. Okay, so I'm showing here a photograph of a recent fault rupture. This is Kaikoura Earthquake in New Zealand. And I'm showing this just to show the variability of surface fault rupture, right? We have beautiful vertical cliffs, a really nice fault scarp shown here. That's pretty neat over a tight area. As we move through the photograph, we see broader deformation distributed across a slightly wider region. And we start to see tension cracks in the lower half and maybe folding, accommodating that deformation as we approach this person in the photograph. So over really short distances, we could hike this in a couple minutes, we're seeing really different surface expression. And that's true when we do paleoseismic excavations. We can excavate 15, 20 trenches, and we'll find slightly different evidence of earthquakes and styles of deformation as we continue to slice trenches perpendicular to that fault expression. So what is paleoseismology? We're trying to identify and figure out this pattern of rupture so that we can tease out the size of previous earthquakes, so the size of the displacements, and the timing of those earthquakes. And timing so that we understand the recurrence of those earthquakes on that fault. We want to know the recurrence because that's what we use to characterize how frequently earthquakes are happening. We want to know the size so we can characterize the magnitude of earthquakes we would expect, and all of that information is used in our building codes here in the Pacific Northwest. Also used in our hazard models. So paleoseismology, imagine that time continues. We have some erosion, we have deposition, and we dig into that and we would see sediments. So this is a paleoseismic exposure. This is a photograph from Kay Shar at the US Geological Survey. And we see stratigraphic units that are offset across the fault. So they're truncated and juxtaposed against older units in this picture, young against old. There's its corresponding unit here. And we see younger unfaulted stratigraphy that overlies it and drapes that upward termination of the fault. Okay, so this is the type of information we're looking for in any paleoseismic excavation. We want to see upward terminations, and we want to see stratigraphy that overlies that fault expression. And then when we try to get the age of that event, we're going to collect age data that overlies that fault expression. So this is the, let's see, the oldest deposit that is not deformed. And then we want to date the youngest deposit that is deformed. And so those ages would help us constrain the timing of this earthquake. We know it occurred sometime between this unit and this unit. Okay, so that's our primer on paleoseismology. So this is a map of the Portland region, home sweet home for many of us. And if we were meeting in person, we would be here at the PSU campus, shown by that blue diamond. And Portland Hills Fault is here, northwest trending. Okay, the Oatfield Fault, East Bank Fault, and here the Gales Creek Fault, which is what I'm going to focus on in my talk today. So zooming into the Gales Creek Fault, over here, I have a blow up of that same map. And we see the Scoggins Dam area. This is Hag Lake. Scoggins Dam is at this end of the lake. And this fault has been largely studied by the US Bureau of Reclamation. I'm going to show some photos of folks who've been working down there. So it was mapped early on by Ray Wells with the US Geological Survey. And the US Bureau of Reclamation is interested in this fault and interested in its potential Holocene activity because a strand of the fault goes through Hag Lake, through Scoggins Dam, shown here. Okay, so they've mapped this fault trace to the south and to the north. We've also mapped the northern section of the fault. We were interested in moving away from the southern area and far to the north so that we can start trying to constrain the length of surface fault rupture on the Gales Creek Fault. So we want to know, if you have a rupture somewhere down here, does it extend further north, up along the entire length of the fault? So to answer that type of question, we would need many years of data. So we have our site I'll be talking about here, the Clear Creek site, kind of midway up the northern section of the fault. When I say northern, I'm talking about this area. When I say southern, I'm talking about kind of everything down here. Okay, so we have just a handful of sites on the Gales Creek Fault. This is a fault that could easily be studied for another decade or two with lots of other paleoseismic sites, detailed mapping on LiDAR, profiles, and identifying other locations that might yield good stratigraphic results of prehistoric earthquakes. Okay, as we have that information, we can start to say with more certainty the length of surface fault rupture. What I'll be able to say today is that we can tell, and so I'm kind of giving it away here, but we can tell from the sediments exposed in our trench and in other trenches from the Bureau of Reclamation that the Gales Creek Fault is Holocene active. And I'll show you the details of that in the next few slides. So this is one of the Bureau of Reclamation trenches, awesome group of people. Here's Ray Wells, who has been working with them. You can just barely make out USGS on the back of his vest, and he's talking to my graduate student, Allison Horst, here. And so this is a trench review. So this is part of the peer review process. Because we make our exposures and they're not long-lived in the landscape, we tend to hold review parties, trench reviews, so that our interpretations can be vetted by others in the scientific community. And so this is another photograph of the Bureau of Reclamation, one of the Bureau of Reclamation trenches. And this is Joanna Redwine from the US Bureau of Reclamation, shown there. So it's been a really exciting group of people working out there. And I'm just presenting one small portion of the work that's been done, the PSU portion of this at the Clear Creek site. So the length of the Gales Creek Fault is about 73 kilometers from head to tail. And it has 10 to 15 kilometers of dextral offset in Eocene basement, and that's documented in a Wells 2009 publication. And we've mapped some deflected drainages along the northern Gales Creek Fault. So Gales Creek Fault shown here. I'm zooming in. The outline of this map is here. Okay, and we're going to zoom into that northern section shown by the yellow box along here. Okay, and so we see the Gales Creek Fault is deflected right laterally. Bateman Creek is deflected right laterally. Iller Creek is also deflected right laterally. And of course, Clear Creek at our site. So that's interesting to us because these are pretty long-lived drainages. We don't have any age constraints on this. So this is another avenue where research could continue. But these drainages are pretty long-lived. These are pretty large displacements or offsets from one end of the channel to the other end of the channel that has been displaced along the fault. And so that further emphasizes that this structure, we know it's offset. We have 10 to 15 kilometers of offset in Eocene basement, but we also have large amounts of offset in these drainages. That's all I'm really going to talk about with this today. I'm just kind of setting the stage that this is indeed, the morphology kind of on broader scales does hint that this is indeed an active fault structure. Okay, so zooming into our Clear Creek site, shown here by the blue star. Okay, so our site is here again by the blue star, and this is a geologic map. So this is from Wells et al. 2018. So our site is located here in intrusive rocks of the Coast Range, and we did encounter diabase in our trench. So it confirmed what Ray Wells has detailed mapping in this area. And I'm going to go ahead and move forward to the next site. So here we are again. There's our geologic map, and I'm just going to continue zooming into our site. So here we are. This box outlines the area of this topographic map. Okay, and this shows the location of our trench here in white, Clear Creek Trench. And I want to take a moment to think about what this contour map, this is a slope shade where warm colors are steeper slopes, cool colors are flat. But I want to take a moment to think about what this is really showing us. And that's why I have this contour map shown over here. Just a plain old hillshade with contours. Okay, and notice these are oriented just a little differently. North is tilted in this, north is straight up in this image. But I wanted to call your attention to this. I think, you know, this is a really nice opportunity. Our eyes are great at picking out patterns. And, you know, if we're thinking about the Coast Range, we're thinking about fairly rugged topography. We're thinking about large rainfall, maybe landslides like we see here, landslide deposits. We're thinking about things that are pretty limited in their reach, right? And pretty irregular in their shape. And so when we see linear features in the landscape, we tend to think that they might be things like roads, shown here, or Clear Creek, for instance, up here in this northern end portion of the image. We have another logging road shown here. Okay, and so what you might be noticing, your eye is probably drawn towards this other linear feature that runs through this map and in this direction, right? A nice weird break in the hill slope. Okay, and so this is the advantage of LiDAR data. We wouldn't have picked this out. In fact, we didn't pick this out when we had 10-foot contours, right? And this is a 5-foot contour, but what I'm showing is data that has topographic data of much better resolution than that. Okay, so our eye is naturally picking that break and slope out, and I'm highlighting it here with these blue arrows if you didn't pick that up. Okay, and so that's the same image that I'm showing here. So you can see this broad bench here, this break and slope, is where our trench is located, and that's shown here in this image. Okay, so I'll be showing the trench results now, a couple different trench logs for that excavation across what we call, this feature is what we call a side hill bench. Okay, so it's pretty continuous in this area. Obviously, we have landslide deposits in this area, so it was important to us to get away from that because we didn't want to trench landslide deposits. We didn't really see anything here that looked like deposits from a recent landslide. And the bench in this area, we hiked it out. It's much narrower. It didn't look like this area was getting as good a deposition. And so for our purposes, we want microstratigraphy, which means we need sedimentation. If we have sedimentation, it means we're recording time. So the higher the sedimentation rate, the better the stratigraphic record, the better the record and the thickness of sediments that is going to separate individual earthquakes that fall to the surface. Okay, so we want that good stratigraphic record. So this is a pretty broad bench, and we augured it before we excavated, and it looked like there was good stratigraphic accumulation, and it looked like we were able to identify the fault just with auger holes in a transect across this bench. So that was why we picked this site. And this is a photograph of the site. You might be thinking, you know, it's awfully green, but notice the steep slope here in the southwest, and then the long flat bench. And there's Allison for scale and a person from the city of Forest Grove here on the bench. Okay, and the fault projects in this direction. So it's really nice. We mapped the fault at this inflection point, this break and slope, to the flat side hill bench. Okay, and so this is a nice plot that shows the topographic profile extracted from LiDAR, and then the footprint of our trench just below that. Okay, so this is what we ended up excavating. And where we interpreted the fault traces to be. We actually had another V trench just off this image, which you don't see here. I'm not going to show results for that today. It didn't yield good stratigraphic accumulation, and it looks like this is a secondary fault. Okay, so paleoseismology during fire season is a lot of work. So this was hand excavated due to fire safety concerns. And I don't want you to think that I stand around waiting for my grad students and the undergrad assistants, research assistants to do all the work. But here we see Allison, Lana, and Alexis all digging in and getting our trench started. We had this dug in a couple of days. And I do mean we. So it was a lot of really fun digging. I think the most difficult thing was personally, I was the largest person on site, so I was handling these big boulders and pushing them out of the trench, and you can see our nice pile of boulders. And this is actually an important part of the story, so I do want you to notice that. We have these big Diabase boulders in the photo here that you can see Lana standing in all around her feet, and they end. As we approach us, the viewers now, there's no boulders up on the side in this area and this area. But here's that steep slope up above, and that's where the intrusive coast range rocks were mapped. We're seeing Diabase boulders, probably sourced from those outcrops. And of course, this was a wonderful learning opportunity. So here we have folks from the Geology 410, 510 Earthquake Geology course, and they're out mapping and documenting offset stratigraphy. They collected optically stimulated luminescence samples. They got to use a ground penetrating radar unit. It was a really great field experience for a lot of folks. And so anytime I have stuff that's nearby and available and COVID isn't happening, I try to turn them into learning opportunities for everyone. So this was a really wonderful opportunity. And so moving into our results. Whoops. Oh boy, that was fun. There we are. Okay, Clear Creek site results. So this is the northwest wall shown here. Each one of these tags shows 1 meter. So from one to the other, that's 1 meter by ½ meter in this direction. Okay, so we excavated a trench starting on that slope down across the flats all the way to the end of the side hill bench. Okay. And again, our southwest wall. So this is a large photomosaicked trench log. We generate these trench logs and then we map the interpreted stratigraphy and structure. And so I'm zooming in to this area in the next slide just to show you kind of a quick glimpse of what the broader stratigraphic units are. So here we are. And we see this nice kind of dark grayish brown soil at the top. This is our modern A-B horizon. Okay, we move into, so modern soil. We move into this kind of mustardy yellow unit. It seems to be a little wedge shaped, right? And we see that there's some boulders that have been plucked out, shown here, and some that are remaining. And these are our markers for mosaicing our trench logs together after we take the photographs. So that's that ½ meter by 1 meter grid that I showed earlier. Okay, so these are the large boulders of Diabase that I showed earlier. Notice that we have this dark grayish brown band of soil here. Okay, that is a nice buried soil that we've identified. And then we have a massive kind of gray unit shown here at the base of the trench that extends further in this direction. Okay, so moving into our interpretations. This is our northwest trench wall. Again, I'm showing our interpretations with just line work and our faults shown on here, and fractures are shown in orange. So faults are red, fractures are orange. Okay. So our primary units I just showed in the last photograph, but unit 10 is that modern soil shown here at the top of the trench by this brown polygon. We have this kind of yellowish, very clastic unit shown here, and that's shown by unit 30 in yellow. We have that buried soil that I pointed out, shown here, and that's shown here by unit 40. And then the massive gray silt here, which is shown here by unit 80 and extending this direction to the northeast. And then our oldest unit exposed in the trench, unit 90 in this area. And this was interbedded siltstones and silts. So really small clastic siltstones, which you can kind of see by the pebble marks. We tried to draw that detail in on the trench log. Whereas the overlying silt unit was just massive with some pedogenic soil development in it, and that's shown by these fractures. Okay, and on the other side of the fault, we found that the primary fault, very near that inflection point in the ground surface, on the southwest side, we had units that we weren't really able to correlate across the fault. So we're clearly getting a good amount of lateral slip that we've juxtaposed units like 50, 60, and 70, which were all pretty clastic. Massive silts with lots of clastic diabase cobbles, and those are juxtaposed, almost vertical orientation against these units that I've just described to you. Okay, so I'm going to go through evidence for our earthquakes that we've identified at the site. I'm going to start with earthquake 2 because it's the most obvious when you're looking at the trench log, and I'm sure a lot of your eyes are drawn to it already. So earthquake 2, we have a buried soil that's been back tilted into the hill slope, shown here. Okay, so we have an earthquake, we have a soil that's happy at the ground surface, imagine just like the soil we see today. An earthquake occurs, dropping the soil down, shown here, and ground motions mobilize boulders of diabase and colluvium from upslope down and infilling the accommodation space that's created by that downdropped soil. So we have accommodation space created and rapidly infilled by what I would call a colluvial wedge, shown here. Okay, that triangular deposit. Okay, so earthquake 2 occurred when the buried soil 40 was at the ground surface. It dropped it down and back tilted it into the hill slope, creating accommodation space that was infilled by diabase boulders and massive silts. Okay. Earthquake 1 occurs. It faults that colluvial unit that was deposited immediately after earthquake 2, right? So here it is. So we have faults that extend up into that unit, and it creates a fissure within the margins of that unit here on the southwest edge. Okay, and so that's shown in the log, the interpreted log down here in blue and by this polygon. And I'll do that one more time so you can kind of convince yourself of it. But there's our buried soil from earthquake 2, down dropped. We have a continuous colluvial unit that sits on top of that surface. That unit is faulted, shown here by the faults that extend up into it. And there are fissure deposits within it, shown there. Okay, so that's our second, our most recent earthquake at the site. And I'm going to get into our third earthquake, and this one is a little bit trickier. So earthquake 3 occurred probably sometime before unit 40, that buried soil accumulated. Okay, and I say that because unit 40 thickens to the southwest. Let's go back one slide. So notice unit 40 thickens to the southwest. It's fairly thin here, and it thickens as we move to the southwest in this direction. Okay. Okay, so if we start to look at unit 40 pretty carefully, well, first of all, the thickening, oops, my arrows have moved here, but this yellow arrow should extend from top to bottom. You see it pretty thick here, and this yellow arrow is supposed to be over here, and it should just highlight that this is much shorter than this area. Okay, so the stratigraphic section is much thicker in this region, and that suggests that some accommodation space was created, similar to what we saw for the overlying unit, where we have accommodation space from the previous earthquake and a thick wedge of material that's deposited here and thins in this direction. So we see something similar, but rather than being infilled by clastics, it seems to be infilled by a slowly accumulating, very fine grain, massive silt. And so another line of evidence for this, we see a gradational color within this unit that indicates that there's a deeper buried soil. So you'll notice that there's kind of a break in color within the unit here. So we have darker material down here, lighter material up here. So that suggests there was some period of stability as this slow accumulation of sediment was infilling the accommodation space in this region. So we have some stability, we have some soil development, and then we get some more pulses of sedimentation taking us back up to that nice flat bench base level on the side hill bench. Okay, and somewhat more rapidly, there's not very strong soil accumulation here, at least compared with the darker colors at the base of the unit. Okay, so that's evidence of all three earthquakes. And this is our earthquake age model for the site. Okay, so what I'm showing are detrital charcoal ages for the units that I've been talking about. So here we have unit 10. So this is the youngest unit that is not faulted, earthquake 1, which faults unit 30. That's that colluvial wedge. Okay, that contain the Diabase clasts. So earthquake 1 is constrained by detrital charcoal samples collected above and below that earthquake horizon to be somewhere between 1,168 and 853 years before present. Earthquake 2 occurs somewhere between unit 30 and that buried soil, unit 40. And it's a much broader, poorly constrained earthquake age. And so here we have less, well, again, it's much broader. So that occurred somewhere between 7,078 years ago and 1,274 years ago. And that really is just a function of the dating that we've done. So we see that we have pretty good ages that agree fairly well here within unit 40, and a really large gap in time before detrital charcoal that was dated and collected from unit 30. So unfortunately, we don't have good sedimentation in the period, this period, several thousand years between these two events. Between these two units, I should say, and when this event occurred. And then we have one older earthquake, earthquake 3, down here. And so that's pretty nicely constrained between deposits from unit 80 and overlying the soil unit, unit 40. Okay, and that occurred somewhere between 8,885 years ago and 8,000, roughly 400 years before present. Okay, and so if we average these out, the average recurrence is about 4,000 years. Okay, so earthquakes seem to be occurring on average every 4,000 years. This is not a terribly long record of earthquakes. And so, you know, again, this is just the beginning of this type of investigation on this fault. And to really have a stronger feeling for recurrence of these earthquakes, we need additional paleoseismic studies. We need longer stratigraphic records. We need to identify more sites that have good evidence of surface faulting earthquakes.
Do you have any idea on the magnitude of these?
I'll continue.
Okay.
Okay, so Gales Creek Fault, it's like you looked at my slides. The best we can do at this time with the limited data that we have is to give a maximum magnitude estimate. And for hazard purposes, that's generally what folks want to see. So if we assume that the entire Gales Creek Fault length, all 73 kilometers, is active, so it all ruptures together in one earthquake, at 73 kilometers length. So for a 73 kilometer long rupture, we would estimate a magnitude 7.2 earthquake. And this is based on empirical scaling relationships. So this is just one of those relationships shown here. And that's from a database of observed surface fault ruptures in the historic instrumented period for strike slip earthquakes in this case. And that's what SRL stands for. So sadly, I think that was Sheila. The best I can say right now is that the maximum magnitude we would expect would be something like a magnitude 7.2 if this full system ruptures from end to end. What we need to better refine these types of estimates would be paleoseismic studies along every length of the fault or every section of the fault with that type of timing information. And then it's kind of like building a beaded necklace together. So if we have a bead of information up here that says we had an earthquake that agrees, for example, with our last earthquake, right? So let's say we're going to just shoot for something like, we'll just kind of say, we'll go with the young age here, 1,000 years before present, okay, roughly. So if we find one observation that agrees there, and we have our site, and if we were to find another site that agreed there, and there, and there, and there, then we can start to string all of that together. But it takes more studies, and that's the type of information we have on faults like the San Andreas Fault, and other larger systems, you know, plate boundary faults kind of worldwide. So that's where I kind of invite students and other researchers to get involved, to get active. There's some really interesting questions to ask about this fault. You know, there's a lot of mapped traces. Looking at LiDAR, it looks like we've nailed down or mapped out the most active traces, but there are other strands of the fault that should be further investigated. U.S. Bureau of Reclamation should be publishing their work in the next couple of years, and they have some really interesting results on these other sections of the fault as well. Okay, so the one thing we can say is that this is Holocene active, which is a game changer. Remember that first map I showed, the current Quaternary fault and fold database doesn't show any active structures south of Seattle here in the forearc, right? Well, it actually shows the Mount Angel fault, and that's because of the Mount Angel earthquake. So there's one little orange blob. So we know this is Holocene active. And thinking back to our regional stresses, I'm just going to go forward one more. Thinking back to our regional stresses, we have that large counterclockwise or clockwise rotation of the Pacific Northwest. Okay. We know that that strain is being taken up, at least in this area, by this northwest striking fault. And so that suggests that other northwest striking faults, like the Oatfield Fault, the Portland Hills Fault, the East Bank Fault, might be worth further investigating for evidence of Holocene activity. So I think this has opened the door to a lot more work in the area to better understand this system of faults and how they're slipping and rupturing through time. So the Gales Creek Fault has produced at least 3 surface rupturing earthquakes in the Holocene. Again, more work will help us refine this record, but this is what we know today. We estimate a maximum magnitude of 7.2 earthquake, and that's not a terribly long rupture. So that is pretty reasonable that we could expect this entire fault section to rupture together. We find a recurrence of 4,000 years, but again, that's something that can continue to be improved with more age data and more paleoseismic sites. And the study has implications for other northwest striking faults in this study area. This is one last photograph of my earthquake geology class out at the trench site. Okay. And with that, I'm going to move into thinking about paleoseismic age models and detrital charcoal and inbuilt ages. So this is a study that I've worked on with Ray Weldon at the University of Oregon, Glenn Biazzi, Usgs, Tim Dawson at California Survey, Dan Gavin, also University of Oregon, and Tom Gilderson at UC Santa Cruz. And this is a photograph of Tim from the California Geological Survey and Tom Fumal, who worked with us in the early stages of this study and has passed away. So this is our recent publication. This was published just a couple of months ago. It's in the Bulletin of the Seismological Society of America. If you're interested, I invite you to look it up and shoot me questions if you have any. So we're switching gears. We're headed south now. We're headed down to the Hazeldale site on the San Andreas Fault. Okay, so this is the northern section of the San Andreas, and we move into the creeping section of the San Andreas Fault. So this is all locked. Creeping section of the fault is shown here at San Juan Bautista. Okay. This is a series of excavations over many years, and we have a couple publications out of this site, and I'm just going to talk about kind of what I've been thinking about, what we've all been thinking about most recently with respect to the age dates that we have at the site and what this means for detrital charcoal and earthquake age models. So briefly, before I launch into the models, the Hazeldale site is located on the southern Santa Cruz Mountains section of the San Andreas Fault. Site is shown here, and this is a hillshade developed on LiDAR. We see the fault along linear drainages shown here, through here along a sag pond, and it projects through this site. We have a nice shutter ridge through here, and a beautiful drainage that wraps around this knob and flows out the valley in this direction, leaving a lot of sediment on the site, shown here. Okay. And so this area shows this map, this larger map. This is a survey of all of the different trenches. The yellow boxes show locations where we encountered large redwood stumps and redwood burl. I took a photograph of this site looking from this knob towards the site, and that view is shown here. So you can see kind of the labyrinth of trenches. Like I said, we've excavated one trench on the Gales Creek Fault, but what we really want to do is to get get a lot of investigators involved, get the manpower out there, and open up series of trenches so that we can have better resolution. If one trench doesn't have great stratigraphy or capture something, another trench might. So these are big multi-year studies that really help us better characterize what we're seeing. Okay, so at the Hazeldale site, we see evidence of 1906. The 1906 rupture extends up into this area, up into unit 200. And we see an older set of earthquakes, earthquake 2, so second earthquake back. This is our first earthquake back. That displaces here, unit 300, shown here. We have overlying stratigraphy, unit 200, which is faulted in 1906, is not faulted by these upward fault terminations. Okay. So moving on, this is another exposure of trenches at Hazeldell. And so this is a nice little, I showed you at the beginning of this, how variable surface rupture can be. This is just a few feet away from the last exposure I showed you. And you can see it's a very different surface expression of faulting, right? And so over really short distances, we see really dramatic changes in the sedimentation, in the style of rupture, and what's going on. So here we see a little graben that's opening up. And what I want you to note again is that this is only showing earthquake 2, and it shows evidence of our previous earthquake, earthquake 3. So earthquake 2 again faults unit 200, but doesn't extend into the overlying units where 1906 faulted, and that's just off this image. And the earliest earthquake in this trench exposure shows unit 400, that's the soil, is faulted along this fault and along this fault, and it warps unit 400 down. That's a nice soil there, and a soil over here. It's just faulted and truncated along that fault. And it creates, again, accommodation space that we see here. Okay, so we see that infilling with really beautiful gray stratigraphy. And on this soil horizon, we can map that soil out down to the base here. Okay, shown here by the orange. So we augured down to find that horizon. And we identified wood chips all along the top of that soil. So this is really significant and pretty important. It was when we realized we were about 2 meters down here. So this is again 1 meter by half a meter. And we found wood chips, 2 meters below the ground surface down here. So that was pretty suspicious. We thought someone had thrown something in the trench when we first found these wood chips, but we actually found hundreds of them. And so these are some of the wood chips that we were finding. So I'm looking down. I told you we kind of hand excavated and augured down. So this is the edge of one of these wood chips there. Here's a larger branch with a saw cut edge there. There's some more in this area over here. And these are photographs of them after we plucked them out. Hundreds of wood chips and pieces of log fragments. And so what that told us is that we had 3 earthquakes, 1906 and 2 others, that faulted deposits that contained these wood chips. So we went from, this is on the Santa Cruz Mountain section, we went from having 1906 as the only known early historic surface rupturing earthquake to, we have 3 earthquakes now that fault deposits that have axe cut wood chips in them. This means we must have 3 early historic earthquakes that rupture to the surface at the Hazeldell site. Okay, and so this is all in an earlier paper that I published in 2014, and I think I talked about 5 years ago, the last time I gave a GSOC talk. So those faulted deposits post-date local lumber harvesting. We found documentation of a Spanish land grant with a whipsaw lumber mill, and that was operating in 1832. But the question really became, if these 3 earthquakes occurred and we have these giant wood stumps, how can we really tightly constrain the timing of when these trees were cut down? Okay, and that helped us nail down our earthquake model. But it also allowed us to test how well detrital charcoal works in our earthquake models, because we have such a precise age from these trees. So this is a photograph of Tim from the California Geological Survey standing on the tree stump. We did not collect this larger stump. It was burnt and gouged in places and not continuous, but there's a fairy ring tree growing here. And so we sawed that off and collected it. So this berry redwood tree is at the ground surface and within deposits that were faulted by 3 earthquakes. Okay, so earthquake 3. We used the tree to get a precise date, of the death of the tree and on the age of the deposits that were faulted in 3 earthquakes. Okay, and then we used that information to evaluate the inbuilt age of charcoal. And the question we were really asking is, how far off are earthquake ages from models like the last one I showed you for Gales Creek that only use charcoal? How far off are they? So this is a photograph of what we collected. This is that bigger tree stump shown here. And you can see it's gouged out. It was burned in the center. So this tree had a pretty big history before it was cut down. And we collected this smaller, younger fairy ring tree stump. And that's shown here. This thing is actually pretty big. That's just 25 centimeters there. It's my coffee table now. So if you ever come over, check it out. It's huge. It takes up most of my living room. Okay, so we collected a transect of samples from growth rings all along this white line shown here. Okay, so 274 growth rings, and that's sanded and polished. And this is showing 50 years. There's 100 years by 3 dots. There's 150 years. So you can see really beautiful growth rings. We have areas where it's pretty tight, but with hand lens and microscope, we are able to count out these various growth rings. Okay, so this is the radiocarbon calibration curve. The red dots show the carbon-14 samples for each of the growth rings that I was showing on the last image, actually also shown down here. So we collected multiple samples from several growth rings. And so the radiocarbon calibration curve accounts for the variation, that's the blue line shown here. It accounts for the variation of carbon-14 in the atmosphere through time, okay? And so this allows us to convert radiocarbon ages, shown here on the y-axis, to calendar ages here on the x-axis. Okay, and so what we see is it's like fingerprinting. We were able to fingerprint the radiocarbon calibration curve because we knew the age of each sample and we know the exact number of years between each individual sample. Okay, so with all of that, the known age of each sample and the time between each individual sample, we can wiggle match the radiocarbon calibration curve. With all of that, we find the outer ring of the tree, the death of the tree. We narrow it down to less than a decade. The best fit date is between 1789 and 1797. Okay, so we have a very precise age for when the deposits that contain the wood chips were laid down. Okay, unprecedented. This is, well, I mean, there are other studies that use this, but for this type of study on the San Andreas Fault, this is pretty unique. So this was very exciting to us. And so with that, we went on to try to test how well our earthquake age model based on the tree data matched our earthquake age model that we used based on charcoal. Okay, so our first publication has our charcoal results, the 2014 paper. So we see a lot of age scatter when we collect detrital charcoal. So for the Gales Creek Fault study I showed you, I only showed you the samples that worked. There's an equal number of samples that I tossed out because they were too old to be incorporated in our model. I knew they were out of stratigraphic order. So when we're looking at a photo like this is just a tree breaking down in the landscape, right? If you were to sample some organics from deposits that were being laid down today, what would be the average age of wood that you would sample? What's the average age of wood in the picture? I asked that question to try to illustrate what inbuilt age is when I'm talking about inbuilt age. We talk about organics, we talk about collecting detrital charcoal. What we're talking about is sampling a piece of wood from any depth within a tree. And if that tree is a long-lived species and we sample somewhere near the center, we're going to get an age date that is hundreds to maybe even 1,000 years older than the actual day, if we're sampling it today, you know, the actual incident or event that we're interested in. So that would be today, right? So we don't know what we're sampling when we dig into stratigraphy. Are we sampling something from the center of the tree? Are we sampling the outermost layers of the tree, which would most closely represent today's date? We just don't know. And in general, we collect a lot of radiocarbon samples and end up throwing away more than half. So this is a plot showing that exact problem for the Santa Cruz Mountains. These are 4 sites in the Santa Cruz Mountains that are all within, well, oh, I don't show the distance here, but I show it over here. So there's Grizzly Flat, here's Hazel Dell, there's Mill Canyon and Arana Flat, and they're really close to one another. You can walk from one to the other. Okay, and so what we see here is number of samples on the x-axis. So for a site or a unit where we run only 2 samples, at Hazel Dell, we see that there's really no variability and everything agrees very nicely, no problem. However, when we have a stratigraphic unit where we run, say, 8 or even 9 samples, right? We run 8 or 9 samples, we see that we have up to 6 to 700 years of age range or scatter between those samples. So we're getting a 600 to 700 year range in ages for samples collected when we run more samples. So the more samples we run, the broader the range of ages. So that tells us what we would expect when you're sampling in a forested environment. You're going to sample all parts of that tree. So inbuilt age is the sum of two components. It's the death of the plant. It occurred sometime before it's incorporated in deposit, and that's what we most commonly think about. But it also represents wood layers at some depth within a log, and that's something that we tend to overlook when we build our age models. So we asked the question, can we try to model that inbuilt age? Okay, carbon-14 ages represent wood layers at some depth within a log rather than the most recent growth years. I've just said that. The death of the plant occurs sometime before being incorporated in the deposit. There was an earlier study by Dan Gavin. This is one of our co-authors, a 2001 study he did where he looked at forest fires and he dated 26 pieces of charcoal from a fire of a known age. And he found, this is a histogram or the association or delay time. Okay, so he found for that only one of the 26 samples that he collected formed within 50 years of the fire. And so we see this kind of log normal fit to the samples that he collected. And so what this log normal fit tells us is that the outermost portion of a tree, we're likely to sample maybe one if we run 26. As we sample more and more, we're likely to collect more samples of the 200-year range for this, or 300-year range. So we're likely to have a greater inbuilt age with the more samples that we run. So these data, this histogram is reasonably well fit by a log normal fit. So if you were to, and what we were wondering was if we were to run, say, 5 samples for this, for some forest setting, would we be able to extrapolate out, if we didn't capture the youngest sample, would we be able to extrapolate out for the type of tree in the environment, would we be able to extrapolate out that youngest sample that most closely matches the date of the event of interest? Okay, and so to illustrate the problem again at our site, we know the death of the tree, shown here. And this is unit 400, which contained all of the wood chips. Detrital charcoal samples, at the least, were offset 130 years. Okay, and we see a couple clusters and ages of samples from that unit. But most importantly, we see a 130-year offset. So we know that our previous charcoal models are offset at least 130 years, but a bit more because these are just averaged PDFs. Well, because the models basically statistically look at the entire age range of each PDF. Okay, so in our paper, what we're looking at now are all of the samples for our site. This is units 200, 300, and 400 at the Hazeldell site. And we're trying to estimate the inbuilt carbon-14 age using a log normal fit to all of our samples. Okay, so this is now for the Hazeldell site, samples that we've shown. Okay, we know the age of the event, that's the death of the tree. Okay, all of the samples are shown here. We put a log normal fit to that sample, and with that we find that the mode of this function is 220 years. So the mode, the most likely samples that we're going to collect, if we don't collect a large number of samples, are going to be about 220 years older than the event of interest. In our case, the death of that tree. Okay, so right away this is telling us that detrital charcoal, at least in the redwood forest setting in the Santa Cruz Mountains, is yielding sample ages, detrital charcoal sample ages, that are about 220 years older than the thing we're interested in actually constraining the date of. Okay, so that has implications for our models. And so I'm showing the implications for that here. So this is a plot. These are probability density functions for modeled earthquake ages at the Hazeldell site. I've mentioned that we have a charcoal model. So this is charcoal only. When I ran those early models trying to constrain the ages of earthquakes 2, 3, and 4 at Hazeldell, this was the age range of earthquake 2, shown here in blue. And this is the age range for earthquake 3. And back here in blue, that was earthquake 4. okay? And so when I constrain the model with the tree only, and I didn't do any of the statistics I've been talking about, I found that that shifted these two events much younger. Okay, so earthquake 2 now, because I knew the tree was there, I could change my OxCal model that I showed you, my Bayesian statistical model, to come up with the age ranges for these earthquakes. And that shifts earthquake 2 younger here. And earthquake 3 is shown here by this mustard dotted line. And earthquake 4 is the black dots, and it doesn't change because it's still only charcoal constrained. So there's no change there. So now I run a log normal trim model using the mode of 220 years that I talked about in the last slide to correct for the inbuilt age of charcoal, because we know it's a forested setting and I'm likely sampling old redwood chunks of charcoal. So we're trying to capture that actual event of interest. So for our log normal trim model, we take our charcoal samples, we trim them using the function that I just showed, that log normal function. And what we see is that they very closely match. They're the green dashed lines. So the light green dashed line is earthquake 2, and it very closely matches what we model with the tree. And the dark green dashed line is earthquake 3. Okay, so this gets us really close to what we know to be the most accurate, and that's with our nice tree slab. And there's not many paleoseismic sites where you're going to encounter axe-cut redwood trees that constrain the timing of your earthquakes. So this was a good test of how we can make better age models that actually reflect the true age of the events with detrital charcoal. Okay, and so what does that mean for studies like the San Andreas fault study or the Gales Creek fault studies? It means that when we take all of these paleoseismic sites, and this is what I'd love to see happen on the Gales Creek fault, but these are all individual study sites along the length of the San Andreas fault. And we can plot the earthquake histories for all of those sites, which are shown here, okay, by those bars. And then we basically correlate. We know 1906 ruptured everywhere, but these black bars show correlations that I've made for different sites along the length of the northern San Andreas fault. Okay, and we have a gap where we need more paleoseismic data to really pull things together here. But if we run these types of age corrections for detrital charcoal sites, what we might find is that it's a little bit easier to start connecting the dots across these sites in places where it's not clear whether rupture continues or doesn't. It might help us deal with areas where we have these overlapping ages. It could also, in fact it will, potentially shift all of these records that are constrained by detrital charcoal younger by a couple hundred years. Okay, and with that, that was all thanks to the tree stump that was cut down by early European settlers and unearthed by us paleoseismologists. So with that, any questions?
Early in the presentation, you showed some Diabase boulders on one that were backfilled in the Gales Creek fault. They looked like they might have been waterworked or water rounded.
Yeah, that was something that I was thinking as well, and I was so confused by it when we first started digging this trench. Let me get to the boulders. Well, first, I'll just go to this map. And so this map shows the extent of the intrusive rocks of the Coast Range. And then this photograph shows some of those boulders here at the surface and more. And yeah, they're really well rounded. And that was really curious because, you know, there's just no large drainage here. It's a steep slope up above us. And fortunately, we had our co-author Ray Wells come out, who has been mapping this area for, I think he said 30 years. And he pointed out the weathering rhymes. The way Diabase weathers is spherically. Yeah. And so we actually had these boulders breaking off like eggshell rinds or orange peels, off of them. So it was really fantastic to see how diabase weathered in place. So we did see that in a few of these, and we'd kept a couple of them just to demonstrate that. But before we figured out it was diabase, it was a bit confusing.
Thank you.
Fascinating. Is it too early to speculate on the Holocene activation of the Portland Hills Fault and Oatfield Fault, and how that might have affected the history of the Portland Basin
Yeah. I mean, it's never too early to speculate, but I wouldn't put anything like that in the media. I think that, what this study does is it warrants further study of these faults, and it's not like they haven't been studied. There's been a decent amount of geophysics done on them. People have been trying to investigate them. The issue is that there's with something like the East Bank fault, it isn't clear that it's not a blind fault. In fact, should I back up to one of those regional maps? So there is some aeromag on this and other geophysics that show it definitely looks like the fault extends up into Quaternary sediments, so it's certainly Quaternary active. But there is no surface expression on it, and it might just be its location, that it's down here in this floodplain, that it's pretty largely modified, so it's just difficult to trace down. The Portland Hills Fault, it would be wonderful to collect more geophysics, in the area and get better imaging of what the fault looks like at depth, because again, it's pretty heavily modified by all of our activity. So the types of things we're identifying out here, like that side hill bench I showed you, those features just aren't preserved in our landscape. They may have been there, but they aren't, from what I've seen, they aren't now.
Ashley, can you keep this map on for a bit? But I've noticed that you've got a red line down here just above the Red Hills of Dundee, which would be just in the by the letters NB. Okay, and then you've got a line down there. I wonder if you've ever been there on North Valley Road. Have you ever driven that section of North Valley Road? Because it's
I don't know that I have. Oh, interesting. It is. I haven't. I don't think that I have. But yeah, I mean, I'm game.
This is my home territory. Okay,
Yeah.
I've lived in Yamhill for 30 years, and I've done a lot. But yeah, I took Evelyn Roloff from USGS through here once to show her, because and I noticed that you've got a red line there. So you obviously have it as
part of the Gales Creek system,
or it would be this kind of curved line. I know you probably can't see my cursor. Yeah. The curved line a little bit to the left of the fault, just kind of to the left of NB.
Oh, I see.
This one right here. Well, I know you can't see my cursor, but anyway, I'd be interested in taking you there, because I've noticed it for years. Even in the summer, there's water standing there, and all the houses have to cross. There's a very straight valley there, and it just looks like sag pond after sag pond along through there.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah, I'd love to see it. And I know, Ray Wells has done just incredible detailed mapping. This huge map was published in 2018. Mm-hmm. So it's up on one of the walls in the geology department in PSU down in S9. But anyway, it's publicly available now, that 2018 map. And he's on campus now. He's retired from USGS. He still does a little bit of work for them, but he is a PSU research affiliate. So you'll find him around our hallways.
He was our speaker 2 years ago, talking about the rotation of the Coast Range, which was great. Yeah. Yeah, I see you've got it on this other one, this LiDAR image. You've got North Valley Road right there. Yeah, a little bit to the left, the curved one that's just to the right of where it says Gales Creek Fault, that curvy.
Oh, this area.
Mm-hmm. Yes. It is sag pond after sag pond.
Interesting.
One thing that got my attention on that map is the lower end of that Gales Creek strand on the right seems to terminate right along the base of Chehalem Mountain. And Chehalem Mountain seems to have sort of a fault block profile to it. Is that a coincidence or is there a connection?
Oh, I don't know.
Well, yeah, I think this would be a great field trip
Yeah.
to the Chehalem Mountains, and I have friends that own property up there, so we may be able to work something out in the future.
Yes, and place names I'm not very good with. I've been here, this is my 6th year up here, so I dove in and got going. I'm working here and up on the Mount Hood Fault, but I am a Californian.
Like a lot of us.
So it was too tempting, you know, that they told me there was no paleoseismologist at PSU, and I figured I could take care of that.
Good. Okay.
Looks like heavy work digging that trench.
Yeah,
Carol,
it's a labor of love.
Yeah.
you have a question, Carol? You're mute. We can't hear you. Let's see if I can unmute you. Carol, we can't hear you. Carol Hassenberg, here, I unmuted you.
Okay, I was able to unmute myself, but now
Okay.
I'm looking at myself. This is annoying. I hit the wrong button. Anyway, I'll just ask my question and then I'll try to figure it out. I just wanted to have you reiterate the movement on the fault because you're showing vertical offset, but I believe you said there was something like 15 kilometers of strike slip motion. And what are you looking at streams? Are you looking at geology? How are you piecing together the amount of strike slip offset on that?
That's an excellent question. And so, yeah, what I'm showing in the map here is right lateral motion shown by these 2 arrows on either side of the fault zone. And it's an excellent question. I say that. I'm going to go back a few slides here. At our trench, I was talking about this down dropping of that soil, right, and creating accommodation space. So very much talking about vertical, apparent vertical at our site. And so I'm going to take us back to that paleoseismology primer. You know, you can have strike slip rupture and you can have really variable surface fault expression along a surface rupture. So anywhere there's like a little jog to the right or to the left, you can get compressional or extensional features. You can get broad deformation. And so that's what we're seeing at our site. So although we have vertical separation of units, we did have a large strike slip component. And we know that because when we look at, I'm going to jump way forward. Oh boy, here we go. So when we look at our trench units, we know that, next slide, here we are, that we have these units are not correlated across the fault zone. Okay, so that tells us that the equivalent of these units has moved in or out of the, well, it's right lateral. So if we were standing here and moved toward us, right? So if we were standing on this side, the equivalent of this is somewhere towards us, the viewer, some number of meters away. And so with a whole network of trenches, we could try to find the matching deposits. With just one trench, we can't do that. And that's what where I'm saying, you know, this is, I think that this fault warrants further work to really start pulling out the details of the timing of these earthquakes, finding longer earthquake records, and figuring out the sense of motion. You know, maybe even pulling out slip per event if we were able to chase features across the fault on both sides, maybe. But, you know, what I am showing is, so we know there's laterals, what I'm saying. Just based on this observation, it's moving in and out of a plane, you know, the equivalent deposits. But we do see vertical, which you picked up on, shown here, right? This unit, this surface, unit 40, was down dropped. It created accommodation space that was infilled by, you know, the stuff that was shaken off of the hill slope up above. And And that vertical, I'll argue, is just a local feature because as I demonstrated in that Paleoseismology primer, surface fault rupture is pretty variable and you can have a lot of different features. So you can have apparent vertical in a dominantly strike slip or strike slip surface fault rupture. So this could just be relative to this small location along the fault.
So that vertical
It's sort of-
drop is, the vertical drop is maybe a meter or a meter and a half?
I mean, it's certainly as wide as our trench because we saw it on both trench walls. So that was, you know, at least I'd say not quite a meter. If we were to excavate, and so I think the next step at this site would be to do a bench trench, so a larger, deeper trench that's stable and preferably digging with a backhoe before fire season. So, but given, you know, we hit the water table and we couldn't get the trench to stay open any deeper here. And it's also not safe. We did have some hydraulic shores in, but it just wasn't safe to try to get any deeper without further shoring. And this was a bit of a hike in with the shores that we had. So the quick answer is let's get a backhoe in there. Let's excavate, you know, out our current trench, broaden it and step back in both directions and get new exposures of the fault and try to get a little bit deeper. But yeah, that vertical is likely just a little local, a local surface expression of fault rupture here.
I
I
don't
think you
remember
said
what
that there was 15 kilometers of strike slip displacement in
Yes.
the Eocene basement. How is that established?
That is from Ray Wells. And I believe it's, there's, oh boy, where was that?
And what is that Eocene basement?
That I don't recall off the top of my head. Did I already skip all of that? Nope. I've been on Zoom all day. Here we go. So this was it. I just zoomed right past it. So 10 to 15 kilometers of dextral offset in Eocene basement, and we pulled that out of this Wells et al. 2009 publication.
Mhm.
Okay. And so that's going to be from, I'm assuming, probably gravity data would be my assumption. So
Uh-huh.
some, but I don't recall off the top of my head.
Thank you.
Mhm.
One of your slides included a term penultimate earthquake. What does that refer to?
Yeah, good question. So we use penultimate and anti-penultimate. The penultimate is, we say most recent earthquake. The penultimate is the previous earthquake, so the one before it.
Okay.
That would be earthquake 2 at both sites, and the anti-penultimate would be the third earthquake back.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question.
There's
We
a
have
couple
some
of,
questions in the chat. If
yeah, a couple of questions in the chat. One about your dating. What about sampling only from roots of the tree that weren't exposed during the earthquake?
Yeah, I think, you know, I'm thinking to this Mount Hood trench. We actually have a trench open now on Mount Hood. And we actually had modern roots that were growing down into our fault zone because trees are incredibly lazy and they like to take advantage of pulverized soil and easy pathways downward. And I think for that reason, we generally avoid tree roots because we don't, if it's modern, you know, it's not helpful to us. As far as the redwood tree slab, you know, I didn't really think to collect the roots. I just went for the big slab that was exposed. Let me escape out and jump forward. It's a good question. I wonder if in collecting something like that, here we go. You know, I just went for these big tree slabs because they were really nicely exposed and we had really pretty continuous growth on them. But if we were to collect the roots moving away from this, you could potentially get a longer record. Our issue was keeping the water table down. We had to pump continuously when we were in there with the chainsaw. And so we would have to draw it down even excuse me, further to expose those roots?
I was,
I think that becomes a safety thing, but it's a really good question. I mean, if we wanted to get the longer, how long was that surface stable? We really want to date this bigger tree. And I told you this is burned and gouged, so it's really not useful. And those roots would have probably given us a better age on that. I do have the GPS locations for this, so maybe that's something to do.
and so my other thought was that you'll have groundwater movement, which can move bacteria, and you can have continual bacterial decay and bacterial ingress. I mean, they found bacteria down in ocean sediments, very old, millions of years old, that revived upon exposure to the atmosphere and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so you'll have, after you may get your movement of your carbon dating because of movement of the fluid and bacterial decay of various degrees.
So I pre-treated the wood samples differently than I do charcoal. I ran all my samples myself, pre-treated them at Lawrence Livermore National Labs. At the time, my colleague Tom Gilderson was there running the lab. And so what I did with these samples to take care of any bacteria or anything that had been moving through the water column that wasn't part of the carbon-14 captured in the tree ring was I added a hydrofluoric acid pretreatment step that would have killed anything else that wasn't within the pulpy wood material.
But after the earthquake, you'll still have movement of bacteria, which will then shift the carbon-14 measurement.
Right, and so that was the hydrofluoric acid step, removes any of those background carbon-14. So I'm only measuring carbon-14 that's captured in the actual organic wood material.
The cellulose.
Right.
Okay. But that could still be affected by the
Oops, you cut out.
being muted and unmuted accidentally, I think. But the bacteria couldn't be decomposing the ingress bacteria prior to the sampling of the material. So after the earthquake, you still could have movement of bacteria with the groundwater into, which then would have shifted the carbon-14 date, because you get that nice broad one.
Well, so because I'm only sampling what's in the wood itself, so that, like I mentioned, that pre-treatment step is removing anything that would overprint it. I'm interested in sampling carbon-14 measured from the depth of that, not the depth, from that particular growth ring. So when one growth ring is put on, I'm only measuring carbon-14 from the cellulose within that growth ring. And I used standard procedures to deal with bacteria and anything else that would have overprinted or added carbon-14 uncertainty to that.
Okay, is it
So
still
the hydrofluoric acid, okay, yeah, the hydrofluoric acid step is a standard procedure to deal with that and to get down to measuring only carbon-14. Each growth ring records exactly and only carbon concentrations in the atmosphere of that particular growth year. And so that's why you do need to take, if you don't take that hydrofluoric acid step, you are probably introducing a lot of uncertainty.
Okay.
The little black dots indicate what, 2 or 3 samples from each growth ring?
So this is for dendrochronology, this is just standard counting procedure. So it's every decade is a white dot, 50 years is 2, and 100 years is 3 dots.
Okay.
And so you'll find cores from trees as well. And the same, you can actually follow, if you can see that, there's pinpoints here.
Mhm.
Okay, so those individual pinpoints show the same kind of pattern.
So another question from the chat. So how is paleo work different here in Oregon versus in the desert environments with erosion higher, tree material more common?
Oh yeah, I've worked in a lot of arid environments, and you know, our trenches are still really hard to dig, but it's generally damp or wet sediments. So, you know, a lot easier to dig. We don't have carbonate developments in our soils, so that makes them a little softer and easier to dig. We have a lot more datable material, not just charcoal, but things like twigs, seeds. So there's more to date than just charcoal. Unfortunately, those types of samples also have some inheritance issues. So we've seen the same kinds of not as bad, but we see scatter in those types of samples as well. So, you know, the two environments they're very different. The rest of paleoseismology, the techniques are generally pretty similar. You know, in the desert, you do get good annual, you know, sheet wash, large events that still move sediment around. So even though it's infrequent, you're still getting it annually on a regular enough basis that you get good sedimentation when you identify a good site. So I hope that answers that question. In general, it's much more enjoyable and far more scenic here. If you like forested settings.
Carol, do you have any more questions that you want to read?
So I think everything else in the chat has been answered.
Okay.
I see a question. Is the Mount Angel Fault considered an extension of the Gales Creek Fault? And, you know, I think that we could certainly make that argument. It's on Streig. It's not very far. So,
Yeah,
more work to do.
They both moved in 1993. And, you know, we saw damage all the way from McMinnville to Malala from that, the spring break quake. So I think they're related. Okay, any other questions? It's been a pleasure seeing everybody again, and hope to see you again soon. Hope to see you all live someday again soon. Okay, hi Janet, good to see you.
A wonderful talk, and I hope that we sometime in the future are able to get out to that fault and other faults near it for a field trip.
Yeah, well, it was a lot of fun. Thank you for all your detailed questions. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Well,
I guess we will turn off the record. We're not going to kick out everyone. We can